Right. Let's make a start to get on time. It's very echoey. I think I could probably shout at you better than this. So just to gauge the room, could I ask people to kind of put up their hands if they're from the legal profession, they're a legal professional? I'm not trying to single you out here. And from compliance? Okay. And advisory here? Okay. So some of you are in the right room, so which is good. Okay, so I want to start off just by giving you a kind of bit of background. So I can't compete with the glitz and glamour upstairs. We're going to talk about an act here, which to advocates is perhaps more exciting than it is to everybody else. But really, when we're talking about the Electronic Transactions Act, I'll give you a little bit of history. So this is the Electronic Transactions Act of 2000 that we're looking to amend here. So an amendment that's 23 years in the making. Now, I'd make the point right now that it's not a very good thing if you have a piece of legislation that's 23 years old that is in the digital space, because clearly things have moved on in that time. I'd also say that for my sins, I was actually involved in some of the drafting of the Electronic Transactions Act as it exists now. Hence why I'm involved now, because in traditional government fashion, they said, you know something about this because you did something 23 years ago. So have a look at this again. So why that's important is to give you some insight as to the process. So Digital Agency are obviously a stakeholder of this particular piece of legislation. And as it was originally put through, and it went through consultation, which I'm sure some of you provided background to, this was done as a kind of DFE. We need to update this regulation. Digital's involvement was as a stakeholder. So originally we got involved to say, yes, this is a good thing. Yes, it should work in this way. As we were involved in that process, it became quite clear that this was quite a complex thing to do. Particularly at this point in time, and I'll explain why that is. So this became a little bogged down. Now, as I'd like to say, digital is part of DFE. DFE's responsibility is to represent business and to actually give a conduit into government. So when it got bogged down, we actually took up the mantle and said, we believe this is important because you, our stakeholders, are telling us this is important and we believe this ourselves. Therefore, we took over responsibility for it. And in taking over responsibility for it, we're now looking very, very carefully at how we can not only change it to be more modern, more up to date, but future-proof it and take into account everything that's happening in the landscape at the moment. So it's not just about digital signatures anymore, it's also about digital ID. So although we're keeping that rather boring title of Electronic Transactions Act, we're trying to encapsulate into that as much as we possibly can of things that are happening around the world to make sure that we're not in a position in 23 years' time saying this is behind the curve. So that's why this has come into our sphere. And again, what I wanted to convey to you is that as an agency, we do take into account what you say, we do take into account your priorities, and we will step up to the plate and actually push things forward if we don't see that they're making enough progress in whatever part of government they're in. So that's my kind of rah-rah message for the digital agency. So if I can, from taking that standpoint, and we want to get to asking people the questions relatively quickly, there's a few slides I want to go through. And the first one is, okay, taking that into account, taking the fact that digital agency want to do this, and we have a whole range of things that need to link into this. So from fintech, digital ID is very important in fintech, right the way through to digitization of government, where things like signatures are very important. So we want to make a statement, particularly about signatures. And the statement is this. This is an aim of what we're trying to do here. Now, we may not be able to do it all, and I'm sure many advocates will point out here are some of the pitfalls of doing this, but let's start off with that aim. And the aim is to ensure that every document transaction that takes place, note the word use of the word every, that takes place in the Isle of Man that requires a signature can legally be signed using a digital signature of some type. Now, that may seem a really simple statement, but actually it's more complex than that. For example, wills are one of those things that in the UK is excluded from digital signatures for reasons that I won't go into now, but we have to look at why those things are and see whether we can do something different, or indeed whether we want to do something different. But all those things are being taken into consideration. If I move on, what's being changed? We talked about it's the Electronic Transactions Act to take into account digital signatures. And as we go into this, for people who are really involved in this, there are some key things around signatures called the eIDAS. So it's a conformance to an eIDAS that allows you to do a digital signature that's generally recognised. Now, because of Brexit, and this isn't just the case for this, there are now two eIDASs. There's the UK one, and there's the eIDAS 2, which is the new EU one. Now, the ramification of eIDAS 2 in Europe is that's part of a bigger thing that they're doing with wallets and IDs. So all of a sudden, what we've got here is a divergence, and we don't really want to go down one route or another. We want to be able to conform with both, but they do very different things. So one is about a signature solely, and the original eIDAS. The other is about IDs as well as signatures. So how do we take that into account? So what we've been looking at really is the combination of those and potentially other standards that emerge around the world to say we can participate in this particular way, but start off with that Isle of Man context. What do we want to achieve? For here, it should be obvious. Increase security and surety for transactions, facilitate easier transaction flows, improve customer interactions and workflows, maintain relevance to other jurisdictions, trade entities, future-proof against rapid digital change, and support the Isle of Man digital agenda. And from that standpoint, there was one thing that came back in the consultation that we had with you, and that was that the original Electronic Transactions Act, for very good reason, allowed some carve-outs for government. From a business community perspective, it was seen as that wasn't equitable in a way. It wasn't fair that there was carve-outs for governments. Now, that was part of the commitment that exists anyway to say that those carve-outs shouldn't be there unless there's a very good reason for them. So it throws the emphasis the other way. You won't any longer be able to say within government, we just don't want to do that. But there are certain circumstances which it might not be possible, but they have to be justified. So it's turning the tables around. So I can give you that commitment that will be there. Okay, so questions being asked. I've kind of gone through some of these. They're technicalities, and all of this will be available to you anyway. We will probably, because of the introduction of digital IDs into this, which is a slightly different question that we asked you in the first consultation, we may come back to another consultation when we get to the result of this. But all of these things are looking at it in a global context. We're taking into account a lot of very smart advice from people who are working directly with the EU and the UK about their frameworks and platforms. So we are taking what we hope will be an agnostic view, a view that says we can fit within a number of regulations by recognizing what's happening elsewhere. And that's what this needs to make sure. So, that being said, what I really wanted to do here, because otherwise it can be a very dry subject if I go through that in more detail, and there will be more circulating of this when we've got a bit more surety about how we're thinking of doing it, probably as I said in the consultation, I'd really like you to ask us questions. But first, before you do that, I'd kind of like to go across the panel here, and from their perspectives, if I could just introduce who they are, and say why you think us having something that properly puts together digital signing and digital ID, why that's important to us in the Isle of Man. And Chris, can I start with you?
Yeah. Is that okay? Yeah, I think so. Right. Well, I thought you were going to start at that end, so I was happily sat here just sort of thinking about other things. But but why I think this is important, I think this is. We've been listening to lots of things about AI, and they've been very glamorous and exciting, and they're going to add all this to GDP and all that kind of thing. And that is an exciting area of technology in it, but it's the future, and it's not all fully resolved yet or fully thought through. Digital identity and electronic transactions are the way almost everything gets done already. We just add another layer of complexity onto it at the moment by making ourselves do a load of stuff on some very old technology called paper that in the end then gets put back into digital systems anyway. And according to some research I read about 2 or 3 years ago now, the OECD reckoned that in general, depending on the level of sophistication a jurisdiction has, it will add between 3 and 13% to GDP simply by allowing these technologies to be used properly and sensibly. And that's not anything in any way speculative. That's a fairly detailed analysis based on the fact that we all, if we have to do a wet ink signature, and I'm doing a few of those at the moment on some other things, if we actually travel to places, people's time gets taken up, and there are real costs, environmental and financial, and inefficiencies, and those costs are greatly amplified if you live in a jurisdiction that is quite remote and expensive to get to, that wants to be a global player in any kind of business. So from the Isle of Man point of view, I think will be at the upper end of those expectations about the financial and commercial and impact of really adopting electronic transactions. And the Act is designed to enable that, and designed hopefully and worded so that we can add new things in, even in the areas where we may have initial doubts. If we do this right, we'll be able to stay at the forefront and add new things in through secondary legislation as they become accepted. But there's a broad brush principle. If it's almost any document or anything, any record that is important in our lives and our businesses is electronic already, and the ability to assert our identity and do business from wherever we are with whoever we want to do business with is a really massive step that the Isle of Man can take quite quickly through this legislation.
Okay, so my name's Richard Oliphant. I work within Digital Agency, and to put some context around this, I'm not an electronic transaction acts expert at all. My role within this is to try and project manage this through to completion. I've been sat in government for quite a while, and it's clear that by carving out elements of government to be able to not do this has restricted and slowed us down in driving some of, I see GTS nodding in there, slowing down some of the development and adoption of digital technologies across our organisation. So from my point of view, that's why I'm here. Interestingly enough, we have gone out to try and get expert help and analysis on this. You would not believe that the guy we brought in from the UK is also called Richard Oliphant, which makes it really complicated when we're having a conversation about it. But he's the subject matter expert, as is Kurt. I'm here to support and facilitate, but any questions about how it works within government, then I'm the man to ask at the moment.
So my name's Catherine Garoud, and I'm an advocate at Appleby. So how this, I think, sort of digital transactions, electronic signatures is important. The Isle of Man is an international finance centre. We shout about that a lot. We're very international business focused, and we'll be involved in transactions that may have 20 different jurisdictions, but somewhere amongst that there's an Isle of Man company, and you'll always get asked the questions of can we sign the documents electronically, and it's quite embarrassing when you have to turn around and say, well, you can do this document electronically, but the company's granting a charge, so you can't do that one electronically. And there might be a power of attorney in that, so you can't do that one electronically. And there's lots of we've got this Electronic Transactions Act, which is, it's very nice and broad, and the sort of starting position is no contract is invalid simply because it's signed electronically. But as people have mentioned, there's carve-outs to that. So we see it sort of from our International Finance Centre point of view. Some of those carve-outs, cause difficulties when you're trying to do international financial transactions, and so that's something definitely we would like to see changed. And I think some of the underlying sort of that ties in with government. Why are some of those carve-outs there? It will be to do with filings at government registries. So we need to bring government alongside, as well as changing the legislation, so that we can be more competitive internationally.
Okay, and a couple of add-ons to that. From the government perspective, obviously as a digital agency, what we're trying to do is emphasise that whole digital agenda, and that obviously includes government. We're all part of the same community. So with some things, if possible, we'd like to be that kind of exemplar to say, well, we're doing this, so why wouldn't others do this? Not particularly in the digital or the digital signature sphere, but there are other things where companies are reticent to do this, and part of that reticence is, well, you don't, so is it safe for us to do that? So we have to break that barrier down and say, well, if we can show you this is a sound methodology or a sound principle, then there's no reason why our business community wouldn't go out and use that as well. And I think that's important for us to do as a government, to start projecting that way, to say, yeah, we take the digital agenda seriously, and we're part of that alongside you, as opposed to just sitting in the background and saying, well, there's one set of rules for you, but we'll actually have a completely different set of rules for us. That I don't think is a sustainable thing going forward. And that's a theme, if you like, of what the digital agency is trying to do. Does that make sense? Any questions from anybody? Ooh. Okay, so can I ask another question of the panel? So kind of looking at it the other way around. So we've said why we should do it. What about the consequences of not being in this space, of saying, okay, we want to stick to our guns and do everything on paper? Is that sustainable, or is that just heading towards us not being viable anymore?
I think it's certainly not appealing when you're looking at why use the Isle of Man. It's a barrier to doing business in the Isle of Man. If we sort of insist on doing things on paper, people will get fed up with that, and they will go elsewhere. I think we've sort of gone on about, we've got this sort of 2020 Act. I think it's the same in Jersey and Guernsey. They have 2020 laws as well. Their positions are quite similar to ours at the moment, but it's just if other people start moving, we're behind where they are in the UK. And if we keep falling behind, I think we will lose sort of international business if we don't, realise these problems. Yeah.
So Chris, could I ask you a slightly different question there? So we're talking about bringing an act up to date. So we're taking a 23-year-old act and saying, well, we want to modernise this. Now, my job in digital is to look at innovation. So to look beyond just keeping up and look towards how can we be slightly better or ahead of the curve. Now, I know there are, in this particular space, there are kind of legal things you have to think through in doing that. But do you think it is advantageous for at least to be seeking to do that, to be above the bar rather than just alongside it?
I certainly do. I think this is one of those areas where we can, because we don't have to put all the investment that the UK or the EU or others inevitably do into bringing huge populations and multiple jurisdictions along with them. We can stand on the shoulders of giants a bit here and recognising, for example, that the EU and UK, you mentioned that they are doing the same thing using slightly different technologies, and they are, but they're doing the same thing. They just because they feel they must, are going about it in slightly different ways. But those differences are relatively trivial. at a technical level, and for us to be able to essentially adopt best practice across the globe, and be able to do business with anyone effectively, actually gives us an enormous advantage, I think, and there's at virtually no risk. So I think the role of government here is really important. And I think you mentioned the 23 years ago, you and I were both involved in some of the conversations through Chamber of Commerce about the original Digital Transactions Act. One of the problems with that wasn't that it wasn't actually quite an advanced piece of legislation at the time. The problem with it was that nobody adopted it. And you've referenced the fact that businesses have been perhaps reticent as well. I think this is more than just about some good legislation being put in place. This is about people pushing the boundaries of what it allows them to do and actually taking the benefits. And I think that's a bit of a call to action to, you talked about compliance people in the room, you talked about advocates in the room and so on. I think it's very important that the business community take the opportunity provided by this, and that government plays their part too, to actually move the island ahead so that we do become a really digitally aware and digitally enabled business jurisdiction, because it's about convenience. And ultimately, the real end point of this, and I think one of the barriers to it in the past has been, for example, people's worries about digital ID being a big brother thing or something that people are compelled to use. My view on this is all about convenience and productivity. And so it's up to all of us to avail ourselves of the convenience and productivity that this offers. And if we do that, then it will be a huge success. And I think, but it isn't just about what government does. Government enables us to do it through good legislation. We've got to actually use it.
And Richard, so in terms of the process we're going through, we've kind of mentioned we're pulling in advice that has fingers in all of these pies to try and pull out what's common. How confident do you feel that we're getting the right input into this, so we do come up with that agnostic view?
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. I laugh because I have to sit through planning meetings with both Kurt and the other Richard Oliphant, which are generally supposed to be half an hour in length, and I tend to sit there for 2.5 hours listening to these guys chew the fat on what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the UK, the different standards are coming along, and how the Isle of Man can leapfrog and be ahead of the curve in this particular space. So I see the work that's going on, I see the conversations that are happening, and it fills me with real confidence. I think we're heading in the right direction. We should have some form of drafting early next year. We have got it on the programme or the legislative agenda for next year, so there's no reason why we can't get this in front of Tynwald next year, which would be a huge advantage, I think, to us. So yeah, I'm pretty confident, Kurt. The conversations I'm hearing are really positive.
That's good. I didn't prime him with that, but I shall buy him a drink later. The other thing I should probably mention here is one other slight context which you wouldn't necessarily be aware of here. So the UK, in its Brexit mode, is going around the world and creating all sorts of agreements, so trade agreements. Some of them are digital ones. So, for example, they're in the process of finalising a digital trade agreement with Singapore, which has been mentioned in other contexts here. Now, when they do that, the Crown dependencies come into those trade agreements almost by default. However, there are questions that are asked of the Crown dependencies. So Singapore, for example, said, okay, how do you do digital signatures? And we gave them our 2000 Electronic Transactions Act, which says a signature can be done for anything, or a digital one can be done for anything that's non-digital. And they went, well, that's not very specific. What do you mean by that? Is it true that that's the case? They saw it as too loose. They said you're not conforming to saying you conform to standards, even though it's wide open. So that was another good reason why we need to do this. So when things like that are looked at in an international context, we can go, yes, our legislation is something that you would expect in this area, and therefore it's safe to have that trade agreement with us, because we certainly wouldn't want to be excluded from those type of things. So I think we're pretty close to our time now. So unless there's a burning question from the audience, yeah, just take the one if I could.
Yes, you mentioned everything, which obviously if you're doing all of this work right now is most important. What form of secondary legislation will you be using to enable you to move fast and deliver the changes that you need to make?
Okay, so just very quickly, I mean, we haven't finalised this yet, but the principles we're using is we're referring to a lot of things. So in the legislation, we'll be referring to EIDAS, EIDAS 2, for example, but we're not going to create our own. We're going to refer to how that exists elsewhere. If we're looking at ID providers, we may have a register of ID providers, which sits outside of the legislation. So you can change that in its own right. Very much like tax agreements are changed here without going back to the primary legislation. So we're looking at lots of things like that. That means that we can react outside of having to certainly change any primary or hopefully even any secondary legislation. It's just the references that we can change. So we're very alive to that because certainly we need to be able to react much, much quicker than 23 years.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.